Nicole Mason had always lived her life by the book, not because she feared risk, but because she had learned early on that chaos had a long memory. At 39, she had experienced enough disruption to understand the value of order. A decade-long marriage that quietly collapsed under the weight of mismatched ambition, a once promising startup job that evaporated overnight after a boardroom coup, and a family she hadn't spoken to in 5 years over an inheritance dispute. Every fracture in her life had driven her to build walls of discipline. So when she finally signed the paperwork on a small, single-level home tucked into the rim of a secluded Arizona subdivision, she did it not for comfort or luxury, but for the simple dignity of silence. The place wasn't much: stucco walls in need of fresh paint, a sagging back fence, and a front yard that had seen better landscaping days. But it was hers. Paid for with a divorce settlement and years of carefully stacked savings, it was the kind of place she could lock down and breathe in. There was, however, one thing she had not anticipated: the neighborhood's obsession with uniformity. Nicole had no problem with shared standards. Her job with the state's Department of Transportation had made her an expert in regulatory codes and compliance issues. She understood the need for cohesion and infrastructure. Hell, she even respected it. But from the moment she moved in, something about this community's tone felt off. The neighbors were cordial but distant. There were no barbecues, no shared smiles across the hedges, just this low, pulsing expectation to fall in line. Her welcome packet, hand-delivered by a stiff woman in pressed khakis, included not only a pamphlet of rules but a literal color palette for acceptable front door paints and mailbox shapes. Nicole had chuckled politely at the time. It felt absurd, but harmless. She placed the brochure in a drawer and assumed that, like most things bureaucratic, it was more bark than bite. 2 weeks after settling in, Nicole decided to install a mailbox. The one that came with the house was a rusted relic barely holding to its post, and she wanted something secure, something substantial. Her father, a career machinist who had passed away 3 years earlier, had left behind one of his old projects, a custom-fabricated mailbox made from industrial-grade steel, reinforced with interior bracing and weighing nearly 400 pounds. He used to joke that it was the only mailbox in America that could survive a tornado and a shotgun blast in the same day. For Nicole, it wasn't just a nod to practicality. It was a tribute. Her father had been the only man in her life who never lied to her, never left. Installing that box was her way of staking a flag in her own soil, of rooting memory into steel. She rented a hand truck, reinforced the concrete foundation where the new box would sit, and spent half a day carefully lowering the mailbox into place. It sat proudly on a square concrete base at the edge of her property, just beside the curb. She polished the burnished metal, tightened every bolt, and stenciled her house number in clean, military-grade black. When she stepped back to look at it, she smiled, not out of vanity, but relief. It felt solid, like closure. That night, she stood on her porch as the sun sank low, casting long shadows across her front yard. She poured herself a glass of bourbon and leaned against the wooden railing, watching the last light flicker off the sides of the steel vault. For a brief moment, it felt like she had landed somewhere no one could take from her. But then she saw the figure. At first, just a silhouette. A woman, mid-60s perhaps, with a thick frame and tight blonde curls that shimmered in the amber dusk. She wore a floral blouse stretched taut over her stomach and held a clipboard with both hands like a minister holding scripture. The woman stopped at the end of Nicole's driveway, stared directly at the mailbox, and then made a sharp note on her clipboard. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Nicole's presence. After a few long seconds, she turned around and walked back up the street, disappearing behind a row of nearly identical beige houses. Nicole stood motionless for another minute, the bourbon suddenly sharp in her throat. The next morning, Nicole found an envelope taped to her front door. No stamp, no return address. Just a single printed sheet inside, stating that her mailbox was in violation of neighborhood standards, and must be removed or replaced within 10 calendar days to avoid citation. It was signed only as Neighborhood Committee Enforcement, followed by a case number and a QR code leading to a site she'd never heard of. No official letterhead, no contact name, just vague demands. She frowned, rereading the notice twice before tossing it on the kitchen table. It felt less like a warning and more like a threat dressed in Helvetica. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she cross-checked the property deed and zoning documents that had come with her purchase. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was there mention of any mandatory architectural control, nor any binding covenant enforcing mailbox aesthetics. If anything, the paperwork confirmed her understanding that the community, while privately managed, did not fall under a formally registered homeowners association. That night, she emailed the QR code link to a contact of hers in the department's legal division. The reply came the next day. Not a government domain. Looks like a private registry, possibly spoofed. Proceed with caution. And then came the second letter. This one arrived via regular mail and bore a slightly more official tone. It was formatted like a citation, listing her name, address, and a series of observed violations, including unauthorized installation of a structure inconsistent with community design ethos. The language was baffling, bureaucratic, and intentionally evasive. But it ended with a very clear consequence, a $100 fine, increasing by $25 per day until the mailbox was removed. Nicole's instinct wasn't anger, it was analysis. She went back to the original color palette pamphlet, cross-referenced the model number of her mailbox, looked up federal USPS requirements, and even contacted the local postmaster, who confirmed in writing that her mailbox met all legal and functional requirements for delivery and security. In short, she had done everything by the book. But the letters kept coming, one after another. Some arrived taped to her door, some by mail. One was tucked under her windshield wiper at the grocery store, and yet there was no one to actually speak to, no name to call, no office to visit. When she dialed the number listed on one of the notices, the line rang out to an answering service, which only played a recorded message. You have reached the Community Oversight Line. All agents are currently assisting other residents. Leave your violation number and a brief summary. Our committee will review your submission within 7 business days. That was the moment Nicole felt the first real chill of something deeper. This wasn't simple enforcement. It wasn't neighborhood management. It was an invisible hand, cloaked in procedure, applying steady pressure without ever showing its face. She thought of the woman with the clipboard, her quiet retreat, and the unblinking certainty with which she had judged. Nicole had expected a sense of belonging in this place. What she found instead was something quieter, older, an unspoken code, a hierarchy she had never asked to join, but one that was already watching her closely. She walked outside that evening and stood in front of the mailbox, running her fingers over the cool, dent-resistant steel. She knew it would outlast anything short of an earthquake. But this wasn't about durability. It was about control. The mailbox wasn't just a box. It was a question, one that the neighborhood had clearly answered. We do not allow deviation. We do not allow tribute. We do not allow memory forged in metal. Nicole crossed her arms and exhaled slowly. She wasn't going to bend. She wasn't going to back down. If they wanted to test her, they'd find she'd been tested before. The mailbox was staying, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest spark of clarity. Not safety, not yet, but something better. Defiance. Nicole didn't immediately react to the accumulation of letters, choosing instead to document everything. She took photos of each notice, cataloged the dates, kept every envelope, even the one found tucked under her windshield, damp with condensation and faintly stained by the oil of someone's fingers. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. She'd learned the hard way that the best defense wasn't just being right, It was being able to prove, in meticulous time-stamped detail, just how right you were when someone inevitably tried to twist the story. Still, a sense of unease began to grow inside her like a splinter lodged too deep to pull out cleanly. She'd dealt with regulators before, agencies and departments with real power, and yet none had made her feel this surrounded. The escalation came quietly. 3 weeks after the initial notice, Nicole received a certified letter that required her signature. It was handed over by a courier who offered no greeting, no eye contact. The envelope was thick, heavy. Inside was a multi-page document with the header Notice of Continuing Non-Compliance and Administrative Assessment. The content was both dense and strangely hollow, paragraphs of formal language outlining her repeated refusal to adapt to communal expectations and her willful installation of a structure inconsistent with pre-approved residential frameworks. The fines now totaled $625. A line near the end of the letter noted, with bureaucratic precision, that further non-compliance may result in legal remedies, including, but not limited to, property liens, municipal intervention, or external enforcement referral. No names, no offices, just signatures labeled Property Oversight Division. Nicole stared at the phrase external enforcement referral for several minutes. It wasn't that she was afraid of legal threats. Her career had trained her to recognize the difference between real teeth and institutional barking. But this language was crafted to unsettle. It wasn't legalese. It was corporate speak, polished to sound neutral and delivered with the dull menace of plausible deniability. There was no address to respond to, no actual human to contact. Just a case number and a portal link she'd already submitted through, twice, with no response. That night, she drove across town to visit a woman named Amy Delgado, a contact she'd met during a transportation committee audit a few years back. Amy was a compliance consultant, someone who spent her days dissecting the fine print of regulation and policy, often hired by developers and city planners to navigate gray zones in municipal law. Nicole brought the entire file, every notice, the printouts, even the photos of her mailbox, and laid them across Amy's oversized dining room table. Amy studied them for almost an hour, occasionally pausing to type something into her laptop or glance through her thick, dog-eared regulatory handbook. Eventually, she leaned back in her chair and said something Nicole didn't expect. This isn't legal enforcement. This is behavioral coercion under the mask of community standards. But it's not traceable. That's the brilliance. These notices, they're designed to look official, but they're not tied to any binding municipal framework. It's soft power, organized, subtle, and completely deniable. Nicole blinked, processing. So it's a scam. Amy shook her head. No, not a scam. A system. One that's been engineered to operate just outside the edge of regulatory light. Whoever's running this knows exactly how far they can go without stepping over a legal line. They don't need to win in court. They win by grinding people down. Back home, Nicole took Amy's words to heart. She wasn't being attacked in a courtroom. She was being cornered in her own neighborhood by a system of invisible levers, ones designed to exhaust her into surrender. That realization gave her no peace, but it gave her clarity. She started logging every mail delivery time, marking when and how documents were received. She ordered a public record of her property zoning history. She even requested a list of all registered architectural covenants in the county and combed through them on weekends, highlighter in hand. Then came the trash incident. She woke up on a Tuesday morning to find her garbage bins overturned, their contents spread deliberately across her driveway. Not spilled. Placed. The coffee grounds were dumped in a neat line, egg cartons broken in a uniform arc, shredded paper fanned out in a semicircle like it had been arranged. At first, she considered a random act of vandalism or maybe a raccoon with artistic tendencies, but when she checked her camera footage, she found nothing. No movement, no tripped sensor, It was as if whoever had done it knew exactly where the blind spots were. Nicole cleaned it up silently, hands moving on autopilot. Her jaw clenched tighter with every banana peel and cereal box she stuffed back into the bin. No note this time. No message. But she knew it was one. This wasn't about the mailbox anymore. This was about her. The next night, just after midnight, she heard the scraping. A slow, rhythmic metallic grind that echoed faintly through the walls. She looked through the blinds but saw nothing. The street was still, her yard untouched. But the sound returned again around 3. This time she stepped outside. The air was dry and cold, the sky heavy with stars. She walked down to the curb, flashlight in hand. The mailbox was still there, untouched. But the base, the concrete pad she'd installed, had faint new scratches across the surface. Not deep, but deliberate, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to pry it loose. The police officer who showed up the next day was polite but tired. He took her statement, noted the scratches, wrote down a report, and told her, without irony, that mailbox tampering wasn't a high-priority crime in the county. He offered to add an extra patrol through the neighborhood over the next few nights, but Nicole could tell by the way he said it that he didn't expect it to change anything. Before he left, he paused on her porch and said something that struck her. "You know, I've been to this street a few times. Never for anything big. Always quiet stuff. Complaints about basketball hoops, lawn height, someone grilling too late. But everyone's tight here. You can feel it, like someone's always watching. It's one of those places where the rules are more important than the people." That night, Nicole didn't sleep. She sat at her desk, staring at the steel mailbox through the front window, illuminated faintly by the porch light. It hadn't moved. It hadn't bent. It just stood there, dense, immovable, final, a memorial, a rebellion, a target. It was then she realized she had stopped being a homeowner. She had become a disruption, and the neighborhood wanted to erase her. 3 days after the officer's visit, Nicole returned home from work to find an orange notice flapping against her front door, pinned down with what looked like a brass pushpin. The notice was larger than usual. Bold print across the top read, "Final Warning," and below it a grid of escalating fines, now totaling over $1,000, each line annotated with vague, bureaucratic phrases like non-conforming structure, penalty, aesthetic disruption surcharge, and continued refusal to cooperate. The language was both aggressive and eerily impersonal. Nowhere did it acknowledge her responses, her appeals, her compliance with federal standards. It read like an algorithm had written it, devoid of human nuance. But what chilled her wasn't the fine. It was the handwritten note scrawled across the bottom in black ink. "We gave you time. You chose to ignore us." Nicole stood there, staring at it in the fading evening light. Not, "You broke the rule." Not, "You need to comply." No, this was a language of personal betrayal. Someone felt challenged. Worse, someone believed she had no right to challenge back. She took the paper inside, photographed it, logged it in her folder, and printed 2 copies, one for her legal file and one for the county records office. But she also did something else. She sat down and drafted a formal cease and desist letter, citing the repeated harassment, the vague and untraceable legal threats, and the unlawful tampering with her property. She sent copies to the county attorney's office, the sheriff's department, and the Department of Consumer Protection. She wasn't expecting fast results, but she wanted a record. She wanted this on file. That night, her motion light flickered on at 2:17 a.m. Nicole, already sleeping lightly, was out of bed before the fixture had finished buzzing. She moved silently to the front window, peering through the narrow blinds. A figure, round, short-legged, wrapped in a pale windbreaker, stood at the edge of her lawn. They weren't doing anything, just standing, arms crossed, watching the mailbox. After 30 seconds, they turned and walked off into the darkness without ever touching the box. Nicole didn't go back to bed. She made coffee and stayed up until sunrise, sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open to her folder of evidence, emails, and timestamps. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. It was growing. By the end of the week, the first real property damage arrived. Nicole came home late on a Thursday, having spent most of the day at the state archives researching subdivision codes. She pulled into her driveway and noticed the glint before she noticed the damage. The mailbox had been doused in what looked like acid. At least one side had bubbled and blistered, the finish warped and discolored. The lock had been jammed with glue or some adhesive that had hardened inside the key slot. The base had fresh chips at the edges, as though someone had taken a hammer to the concrete and struck it repeatedly in frustration. The mailbox itself was still upright, still secure, but the message was clear. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was war. Nicole called the sheriff's department again. This time she insisted on filing a full vandalism report. When the deputy arrived, he took it more seriously, especially when he saw the acid damage. "Looks like someone tried to melt it off the curb," he muttered, crouching beside the base. He asked a few more questions this time, whether she had any active disputes, if there had been confrontations. Nicole was honest. She explained the mailbox letters, the fines, the escalating tone, the night figures. The deputy didn't make promises, but he said something unusual. "I've seen neighborhoods like this before. Real tight, real quiet, all smiles on the surface, but underneath, control freaks. People who think their lawns are battlefields." She wanted to laugh, but didn't. There was nothing funny about it anymore. That night, she reinforced the camera system. She added 2 new units, one pointing directly at the mailbox and another sweeping the front yard from an upper window. She also installed a hidden mic under the porch eaves, syncing the feed to her tablet. Then she took her last step of the evening. She emailed her attorney and requested a private investigator referral, not to solve the case herself, but to build a case someone else could solve if she no longer could. A week passed. The letters stopped. The fines froze. No new threats appeared. It felt like a retreat, but Nicole knew better. She wasn't being left alone. She was being studied. The silence broke the following Saturday. Nicole was loading groceries into her car outside the local hardware store when she noticed a familiar figure 3 aisles over. The woman with the clipboard. Now, dressed in a light pink tracksuit, hair pulled tight under a sun visor, she was standing beside a man. Tall, balding, with a serious gut and an off-brand golf shirt stretched over his frame. They weren't shopping. They were watching her. Nicole stared back. The woman smiled, said something to the man, and they turned away together, slipping out the front entrance without purchasing a thing. Nicole stood there, holding a carton of nails in one hand, a slow burn rising in her stomach. She knew that look. She'd seen it before. People gathering intel not for justice, but for leverage. This was about pressure, not order. They were watching for cracks, waiting for weakness. But Nicole had survived worse than bureaucracy, worse than smug suburban tyrants. The only thing they were doing now was sharpening her aim. That evening, Nicole reviewed her footage from the past 2 weeks. Around 4:12 a.m. 3 nights prior, a vehicle, dark sedan, no visible plate, had slowed in front of her house, idled for 13 seconds, then accelerated without stopping. A minute later, lights flicked on in the house across the street. She cross-referenced it with her timeline. It matched the night her mailbox was damaged. She sent everything to her PI. She didn't tell anyone else. No grand declarations. No public arguments. She wasn't giving them more fuel. But she also wasn't just defending anymore. She was tracking, countering, setting her own markers. The next morning, she walked out to the mailbox and stood beside it. Her breath clouded the morning air. A jogger passed on the opposite side of the street, glanced at her, looked away. Nicole ran her hand along the pitted, scarred metal. The acid hadn't eaten through. The glue had been burned out. The lock replaced. And now a small, nearly invisible camera sat under the lip of the overhang, feeding live video straight to a cloud server she'd set up in the previous 48 hours. The mailbox was no longer just steel. It was bait. The footage arrived by email. A short, silent clip, grainy and distant, but crystal clear in its implication. Nicole sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, fingers motionless over the keyboard, her untouched coffee growing cold beside her. The camera that captured the video wasn't hers, but a neighbor's, positioned just right to catch the entire front curb where her mailbox stood like a monument. A stocky figure moved into frame, wrapped in a pale, familiar floral windbreaker. She didn't sneak or hurry. She approached the mailbox with the calm precision of someone completing a chore, removed a squat bottle from her oversized tote, and sprayed its contents in deliberate, measured arcs along the lock, the corners, the engraved numbers. She paused briefly, admiring her work, then turned and walked away as if she'd merely watered her garden. Nicole didn't gasp or swear. She simply leaned back in her chair and breathed out slowly. This was no surprise. She had expected this confirmation. The message from her investigator was curt and professional. Identity consistent with previous descriptions. Footage provided by private resident. Usage approved. No name mentioned. None needed. Nicole already knew. It was Karen. Karen, the center of the neighborhood's social web, the kind of woman whose porch decor rotated with seasonal exactitude, whose dog always barked only once, who never raised her voice but somehow always got what she wanted. No official role, no badge or title, but her influence seeped into every corner of community life like mold in drywall. Slow, invasive, nearly impossible to remove once rooted. Now, Nicole had something Karen didn't. Evidence. Not speculation, not whispers behind hedges. Actual proof. Nicole didn't print the video or post it online. She didn't march down the street to confront her. She forwarded the clip to her attorney along with a complete timeline of damage, correspondence, emotional strain, and monetary loss. A formal complaint was drafted immediately and sent to the LLC behind the so-called Oversight Committee, an entity registered in a different state, hidden behind a mail forwarding service and a generic management company. The letter demanded that all harassment cease, all fines be retracted, and all further contact go through legal channels. It included a request for restitution for the physical damage and a warning that any further escalation would be interpreted as intent to harass. Nicole waited, not passively, not with fear, but with the calculated silence of someone who's already taken the next 3 steps and is waiting for others to catch up. When the response finally came, it wasn't a letter. It was a zip-tied tag on the back handle of her mailbox, white plastic with a stamped phrase, "Pending further review." No signature, no contact info. Just the phrase, hanging there like a verdict waiting to fall. She removed it with gloved hands, bagged it, and added it to her growing folder. It wasn't about mailboxes anymore. This was no longer a matter of compliance or disagreement. This was about breaking someone who refused to yield. Through language, through isolation, through small, steady acts meant to push her toward the door without ever physically touching her. It was not a war fought with fists or flames, but with legalese and long silences, with neighborhood glances and social exclusion. And Nicole? She didn't flinch. A neighbor, one who had never spoken to her before, approached the next day while she was setting her sprinklers. An older man, tan arms folded across his chest, voice low and steady. "I saw the footage," he said, not looking at her. "A friend shared it." He paused, then added, "You're not wrong. Just be careful. You're shaking something most of us learn to live with." He didn't wait for a reply. He nodded once and walked away, back into the silence of his pristine backyard. It wasn't support. It wasn't alliance. It was a warning wrapped in reluctant respect. Later that week, a certified letter was delivered by courier, official in tone, almost smug in its confidence. It offered Nicole a community reconciliation option, a proposal that she accept a committee-approved mailbox, provided free of charge as a gesture of goodwill. In exchange, the committee would consider her record resolved and cease further penalties. It was worded gently, but its intent was sharp. Surrender with dignity, and we'll stop. Fight, and we'll keep grinding you down. Nicole didn't respond. The mailbox remained. And somewhere beneath the well-watered lawns and matching shutters, something began to shift. People looked longer when they passed her house. Cars slowed. Curtains moved. Nicole wasn't just the woman with the heavy mailbox anymore. She had become something else. A test case. A mirror. A line in concrete that wouldn't budge. The silence didn't last long. Within a week of ignoring the so-called reconciliation proposal, Nicole began receiving mail that looked different, not just in content, but in tone, typography, even paper quality. It arrived in glossy envelopes with embossed seals that mimicked official documentation, but didn't reference any actual government department. The letters inside were printed on stiff cream stock and signed Resident Compliance Board, a name she hadn't seen before, yet the language mimicked legal threats, mentions of community sanctions, special assessment actions, and eligibility, review for neighborhood privileges. It was theater, cloaked in bureaucracy, written to sound lawful but crafted to skirt just beneath the threshold of regulatory scrutiny. The threats weren't fines anymore. They were warnings of disconnection. Access to local waste services could be restricted. Her water meter might be subject to independent audit. Refusal to align with the collective vision of our neighborhood may result in logistical consequences. One letter read, as though her property's utility access was somehow tethered to emotional alignment. But Nicole knew the difference between threats and pressure. And this was pressure, pure and corrosive. She took the letters to her lawyer, who reviewed them line by line with a cold smile. "This isn't about legality anymore," she said. "This is an institutionalized bullying campaign wrapped in procedural language. The LLC you're dealing with is now using a layered shell structure. They've folded under a nonprofit banner with vague community uplift goals. That lets them apply for small civic grants and keeps them under most financial oversight radars. You're not dealing with a board. You're dealing with a soft-front corporate entity using community aesthetics as a smokescreen." Nicole nodded without speaking. She wasn't surprised. It was too carefully organized, too confidently executed. It had funding, coordination, and a legal team crafting every phrase. This wasn't about her mailbox, it was about precedent. If she held her ground, she proved it could be done. And they couldn't afford that. Things began to change outside as well. Her trash cans, once left unbothered, were now regularly overturned, not carelessly but with intent, placed at odd angles in the middle of her driveway, contents spilled in geometric spreads like someone was mocking her sense of order. Her security cameras caught movement. Dark figures at a distance, never identifiable, never on her land, always just enough to trigger alerts but not close enough to justify a call. Motion lights flickered for no reason. Her water pressure dropped suddenly and without warning, returning to normal just before she called for service. Her mail began to arrive late or not at all. Packages were marked delivered but never appeared. One evening, she found her porch plants uprooted and laid neatly across the welcome mat, dirt mounded in two symmetrical piles beside them. She reported everything, as always. Logged it, documented it, added it to her steadily growing archive. Her investigator cross-referenced timelines and concluded that the incidents coincided with specific local board meetings Nicole was never invited to, gatherings she'd never even been notified of. Yet somehow, her name kept appearing in internal summaries, retrieved through open records requests her lawyer filed with city offices. It turned out that the so-called Resident Compliance Board had lobbied for neighborhood governance recognition through a municipal pilot program and had been granted advisory status, giving them non-binding but influential oversight on local residential disputes. They weren't official, but they were loud, and city staff had learned to treat them as real because they were persistent. Nicole's legal team responded by filing a petition with the county clerk to initiate a review of the organization's nonprofit status and financial disclosures. Simultaneously, her attorney sent cease and desist letters to the LLC, the nonprofit shell, and the management group connected to the addresses listed on the harassment notices. This wasn't going to stop with demands. It had to be pulled up by the root. But this new aggression also required Nicole to act physically, not just legally. She replaced her front-facing security cameras with upgraded models featuring AI recognition and cloud backups. She installed underground wiring to detect vehicle weight shifts across her driveway and contracted a technician to run a full diagnostic on her utility connections. It turned out a secondary access box had been tampered with, likely by someone with outdated but functional utility keys. It wasn't legal, and it wasn't reported, just subtle. Enough to cause a few headaches without tripping official alarms. Her PI provided a list of names: members of the compliance board, board members of the LLC, donors to the nonprofit, and, of course, Karen. The list included local property developers, a low-tier lobbying consultant, and a marketing strategist who once ran reputation campaigns for real estate firms in the area. It was no longer a neighborhood issue. It was a test bed. Nicole's resistance had become a metric. How long before someone like her gave up? At what point did personal boundary fold under collective administrative assault? She had become their case study. But the difference was, she knew she was being studied. And she didn't break. Things finally crossed a line when a city inspector showed up unannounced and unscheduled, claiming to be conducting a routine property line reassessment. Nicole asked for ID. He showed her a laminated badge and city-issued clipboard, but something about his demeanor was too casual, too familiar. When she asked what triggered the reassessment, he stammered, mentioned a concern over boundary violations, and backed off quickly when Nicole began recording. The video, shared with her attorney, revealed something interesting. He wasn't a current city employee. He had left the planning office 3 years prior. The badge was expired. The inspection, fabricated. Another attempt to intimidate her by impersonating authority. That night, Nicole didn't sleep. She re-watched the video of the acid attack. She scrolled through incident reports, court filings, correspondence logs, and then she made a decision. Not to fight harder, not to escalate in return, but to outlast. This wasn't a game of matches. It was siege warfare. She doubled the weight on the mailbox base with reinforced concrete and metal anchors bolted 4 feet deep. She installed a spotlight rig that activated on a 10-second delay after motion, giving the illusion of a human response rather than automated light. And she planted 2 new trees beside her porch, not for beauty, but to eventually block direct lines of sight from the road. Karen remained silent. She hadn't been seen in days. Her house sat like a dormant volcano, quiet, still, but with that air of waiting. Nicole knew better than to assume silence meant surrender. It meant regrouping, redirection, maybe even legal recalibration. But by now, Nicole had become unmovable in a different way. Not out of stubbornness or spite, but clarity. They weren't trying to protect the neighborhood. They were trying to turn it into something else, something curated, manufactured. And Nicole, with her immovable steel box and unblinking cameras, was a flaw in their design. She didn't plan to fix that. She planned to stay exactly where she was. It started with a knock on the door, not loud or frantic, but deliberate. A single repetition like a trigger being tested. Nicole paused in the middle of organizing her case files, took a slow breath, and walked to the door, already knowing who, or rather what, was on the other side. She didn't open it right away, just peered through the peephole. On the porch stood two people, a man in a pressed charcoal suit with an expression carved from granite, and a woman in a black blazer clutching a leather folder so tightly her knuckles had turned white. No uniforms, no name badges, but official enough in posture, polished enough in presence to suggest this wasn't another bluff. Nicole opened the door with practiced calm, and the man introduced himself as representing the Legal Risk Compliance Liaison of the neighborhood's Oversight Council. No business card, no credentials, just titles, all vague, all weighty. He informed her that due to continued non-compliance, a formal review of her property had been escalated to Stage 3 resolution, an internal process which, he noted, allowed for immediate external arbitration under the Community Compact bylaws. Nicole interrupted him with a single sentence. "I've already filed injunctions and submitted cease and desist orders. Any attempt to execute that process will be met with legal counteraction." She watched the flicker pass through the woman's eyes. Hesitation, maybe even fear, but the man didn't react. He only asked if she would sign a waiver agreeing to a non-binding resolution meeting to clarify intentions. Nicole told them no. The door closed softly but with finality. She didn't watch them leave. She didn't need to. An hour later, her internet went down. At first, she thought it was a coincidence, but the timing was too perfect, too precise. Her service provider claimed it was a neighborhood-level disruption, no ETA for restoration. That same night, 3 of her cameras dropped signal. The next morning, her mailbox was hit, not by acid or glue this time, but by something more aggressive. The lock had been ripped clean out, bolts twisted, the front panel dented inward like someone had swung a crowbar with full force. This time, they didn't even try to hide it. It wasn't a warning. It was a message. "You didn't sign, so now we escalate." Nicole didn't panic. She documented, as always. But now, her lawyer had enough to act. A full criminal complaint was filed citing destruction of property, pattern harassment, and impersonation of officials. But the true break came when a clerk in the county record's office contacted her privately, anonymously. The message was simple. "Check the property map for your block. It was modified last month. Quietly." Nicole did. What she found stunned her. The parcel data had been updated to reflect a new overlay, Community Development Zone C, a designation that allowed for broader easement control and fast-track infrastructure modifications. Her lot had been included without notification, flagged with an internal tag. Passive resistance structure, subject to evaluation. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at that screen, the implications slicing through her like razors. They were reclassifying her land, not to take it, but to regulate around it, undermine her from the soil up. Utilities, roads, even storm drains. They could use that tag to justify cutting her out piece by piece until her property was surrounded by their will. This wasn't just neighborhood manipulation anymore. This was coordinated pressure from multiple levels, using technical loopholes to disassemble her autonomy. That night, she didn't sleep. She reviewed every document she'd gathered, every video, every scanned notice and audio clip. And then she made a decision. Not reactionary, not emotional, but tactical. The next morning, she called a press contact not from a newspaper or website, but from a legal reform nonprofit specializing in property rights abuse. She sent them a package of redacted files, cleared for publication. She wasn't going public to go viral. She was going public to initiate institutional review. Within 48 hours, the nonprofit filed a formal complaint with the state attorney's office, not naming individuals, but naming tactics. Coordinated zoning adjustments. non-transparent enforcement councils, unauthorized data changes in public records. Suddenly, the game changed. She wasn't the only one watching anymore, and the people behind the curtain knew it. The retaliation was fast. Her electricity flickered for hours, dropped entirely for half a day before city engineers claimed faulty meter calibration. Her trash pickup was skipped 3 times in a row. Her water pressure dropped again, this time accompanied by brown sediment. But by now, she had remote backups, battery systems, bottled water, and a backup generator ready to kick in. They couldn't make her leave with discomfort. They had underestimated how far she would go to remain unbroken. Then came the subpoena. It was unexpected, but not shocking. The oversight entity filed a civil claim citing malicious obstruction of collective residential improvement, a term so vague it may as well have come from a dystopian playbook. Her legal team laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was desperate. It was their last card. A court filing meant exposure, depositions, evidence discovery. Nicole counterfiled with claims of harassment, civil intimidation, and tampering with public infrastructure. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. It was clinical. Facts laid out in neat rows, exhibits displayed in sterile digital formats. But by the time her attorney presented the parcel overlay map, tied to dates and unexplained registry adjustments, the judge's expression shifted. When the correspondence timeline was displayed between the so-called board and city contractors, unofficial, unapproved, but damning, the silence in the room stretched long and thick. Nicole didn't speak throughout. She just sat, listening, composed, letting the weight of truth do what confrontation couldn't. In the end, the oversight group withdrew its claim, not voluntarily, but under pressure from the court, warned of potential escalation to a fraud investigation. The nonprofit's review continued. An independent audit of property committee funds was initiated. And Karen? She resigned from her position on the board within the week, citing personal matters. But Nicole knew it wasn't over. What they'd tried to do to her wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And what she had done wasn't a win. It was a crack in their armor, a warning. The mailbox, though battered, still stood, and it always would. It didn't end with a bang or a moment of grand vindication. It ended the way most real battles do, quietly, in stages, with more silence than celebration. The ruling that dismissed the committee's claim against her wasn't delivered in dramatic fashion, just a stamped order emailed to her attorney along with a schedule for administrative follow-up. The audit triggered by the nonprofit's filing revealed financial irregularities. Nothing criminal, yet, but enough to suspend several of the committee's privileges and funding streams. Local officials, once comfortably indifferent to the group's influence, suddenly became cautious, issuing new transparency protocols and public participation mandates for any future zoning overlays. No one said it directly, but Nicole understood. She'd dragged something unpleasant into the light, and now the city wanted it cleaned without admitting it had ever been dirty. Karen disappeared from sight. Her house went dark at night, no more rotating porch decor, no more afternoon walks with her clipboard or curated pleasantries. For weeks, Nicole didn't see her car move. Then one morning a moving van pulled up, and by that evening, Karen was gone. No farewell. No explanation. Just silence and a freshly mowed lawn in front of a now vacant property with a discreet "For Sale by Owner" sign that looked like it had been ordered quietly and in haste. There was no parade for Nicole. No offers of apology from the neighbors who'd stood by silently, but there were small shifts, subtle but real. A woman down the block who had previously never acknowledged her began waving each morning. The older man who'd once warned her in hushed tones now occasionally stopped by her front yard and made casual conversation about weather and water pressure. One day, she found a potted fern left on her porch with a handwritten card that simply said, "Thanks for holding." It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a name. She left the plant on the porch where it could be seen and watered it daily without comment. Nicole didn't change her mailbox. The dent from the crowbar remained, not as an eyesore, but as a testament. The acid stains, though dulled from weather and time, were still faintly visible under the afternoon sun. She had thought about sanding them down or repainting the panel, but ultimately decided against it. The box was no longer just a receptacle for mail. It was a memorial to the idea that standing still, when done with purpose, could be as powerful as any act of defiance. She upgraded the security system one final time, not out of fear, but as closure. Solar-powered cameras, perimeter sensors, a reinforced doorbell array that streamed live to an encrypted cloud. There was nothing paranoid about it. It was just a logical conclusion to months of psychological siege. She never felt afraid again. She wasn't waiting for the next retaliation. She had already endured the worst they could summon without breaking. What remained now was not anxiety, but vigilance, the kind of steady, measured awareness that doesn't control your life but ensures no one else ever will. A few months later, she was approached by a county-level mediation group working on reforming policies around quasi-private enforcement councils. They asked if she would consult on the project, not as an activist, but as someone who had endured and resisted. Nicole agreed, but only with the condition that her name not be attached to any public-facing materials. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She had no desire to be the face of resistance or the cautionary tale communities pointed to. She wanted her life back, not a spotlight. Her contribution was technical. Recommendations on oversight structures, audit triggers, mandatory transparency thresholds. She offered them insight the system didn't usually get. The view from below, where authority becomes a shadow and rights must be defended with documentation, not hope. She still walked the perimeter of her yard twice a week. It wasn't about surveillance. It was about presence. Her boots on gravel, her shadow over the concrete, the weight of her gaze sweeping the fence lines. Her land, her boundary, her terms. No one else touched the mailbox anymore. Children rode their bikes past it without incident. Delivery drivers, once hesitant, now placed packages beside it without a second glance. It had gone from controversy to fixture, and in that transformation was a lesson not only for her, but for everyone who had watched her fight and wondered in private what it might feel like to say no and mean it. On the anniversary of the first letter, the flimsy notice that had tried to set everything in motion, Nicole stood beside the box with a cup of coffee in hand. The sun was just rising, casting long, clean shadows across the pavement. She reached out and touched the dented side panel, not with nostalgia, but with recognition. This was not the end of something. This was the world after, a space she had carved and defended, a shape she had refused to alter. She sipped her coffee and smiled, just slightly, then turned and walked back to her house where the lights were warm and the doors were locked. Not to keep the world out, but to remind it. This place is claimed. This space is owned. And here, no one votes on what belongs.